For 2 winters, a German officer slept in the room directly below Audrey Hepburn's bedroom, and every night she lay awake counting his footsteps on the stairs. He arrived on a Tuesday in October, without warning and without apology. 2 soldiers knocked once, walked past her aunt into the hallway, and made a slow circuit of the house, opening doors, testing floorboards, saying nothing. Then one of them took a piece of chalk from his coat and made a small mark beside the front door, and that was how a family learned their home had been requisitioned. The officer came the following morning with 1 leather case and took the front room, the warmest room in the house, the one with the piano. The family was permitted be upstairs and the kitchen. There were no papers to sign and nobody to complain to. He never raised his voice, never threatened anyone, never once said an unkind word in the entire time he lived there. And that, she would say much later, was the most frightening thing about it. Because a man who shouts tells you what he wants. This one simply existed in the room below, polite and unreadable, while above his head, hidden under a loose board in the attic, sat a small wooden radio that could have killed every person in the house. She was old enough to understand exactly what the chalk mark meant, and young enough to still be surprised that a house could be taken with a piece of chalk. Nobody in the house slept properly that first night.
The rules arranged themselves without anyone speaking them. You did not use the front stairs after 8. You did not run water late because the pipes ran down through his wall. You learned which of the 17 steps creaked, the 4th, the 9th, the 2nd from the top, and to place your feet in the silence between them, the way a dancer learns a floor. Audrey was good at this. Years of training her body to go exactly where she told it now had one new purpose: crossing a landing at midnight without existing. The officer left at 7 each morning and returned at 6 each evening, and between those hours the house exhaled. Then his key would turn and everyone would find something quiet to do. Some evenings he played the piano. He was not good. He worked through the same 3 pieces, always stopping at the same difficult passage, starting again, stopping again, for an hour at a time, while a family sat 2 floors above him listening to a stranger fail at Schubert in their own front room, not daring to move. Winter made it worse. The upstairs had no heat, so the family lived in coats and slept in them, while beneath their floor a fire burned in a grate they could no longer use. Her aunt began pausing at the top of the stairs each evening, listening downward before going down. Nobody called it fear. It was simply the shape of the house now, and after a while it stopped feeling like something done to them and started feeling like something that had always been true.
The radio had come into the house before he did, and that was the whole problem. It had been left by a cousin who did not come back, a small brown wooden thing with a cracked dial, and it lived beneath a loose board in the attic. Owning it was a crime. Listening to London on it was punishable by whatever the officer standing in front of you decided. And the attic sat directly above the front room, above him. They listened once a week, late, with the volume turned down so low that Audrey had to lie flat on the floorboards with her ear almost touching the fabric of the speaker, holding her breath so that her own breathing would not drown out a voice reading numbers and names from 400 miles away. Afterward, she would replace the board, smooth the dust with her sleeve, and lie in bed feeling her heart go for another hour. Her aunt thought they should get rid of it. Audrey could not explain why she felt they must not. What came out of that speaker was rarely dramatic. It was numbers and place names, a voice reading a list of towns in a flat, unhurried English that gave nothing away. But somewhere inside that list was the answer to the only question anyone in the country actually had: whether this would ever end. And a voice speaking calmly from a place the occupation could not reach was worth more than the information itself. That was what she could not explain to her aunt. The radio was not from news. It was proof that somewhere the world went on without permission.
The near miss came in February, on a night with no wind, when sound traveled. She was on the attic floor with her ear to the speaker when she heard the 4th step creak, then the 9th. He never came upstairs. In 2 winters, he had never once come upstairs. She turned the dial off, and the small click of it seemed to fill the house. Then she lay perfectly still in the dark, with her cheek against cold boards, listening to a man stand on a landing directly beneath her for what she later swore was 4 full minutes. She could hear him breathing. She thought about the loose board under her ribs, the cracked dial, her aunt asleep 2 rooms away, and found she was not thinking in words at all, only holding herself motionless. Then the 9th step creaked, and the 4th, and a door closed below. And a moment later, through the floor, the piano began. The same 3 pieces, the same difficult passage, over and over, far later into the night than he had ever played before. Afterward, she could not remember getting up. She remembered only being in her own bed, with the blanket to her chin, still dressed, still wearing her shoes, listening through 2 floors to that same passage failing over and over. She counted it. 41 times he tried it, and 41 times he stopped in the same place, and she understood with a sick clarity that she had no idea what she was listening to. A man distracting himself, a man deciding something, or a man simply unable to play the piano.
She never knew what happened on the stairs that night, and she thought about it for the rest of her life. There were only 2 possibilities, and neither of them ever resolved. Either he had heard nothing and simply stopped on a landing for reasons of his own, or he had heard everything and gone back down. She looked for a sign afterward and never found one. He did not search the house or report anything. He also did not soften, did not smile, offered no word that could be held up as evidence of anything. He remained what he had been, a polite stranger who took the warm room, played the piano badly, and said good morning in careful Dutch to people whose house he had taken. Whatever he was, he never showed it to her. She stopped listening to the radio for 3 weeks after that night, then started again, because not knowing what was happening in the world had begun to feel worse than the risk of knowing it. She used to build the arguments for both sides, the way you worry at a loose tooth. If he had heard her, then he had chosen, and one small human decision had saved 3 lives, and everything she believed about how people behaved under occupation got more complicated. If he had not heard her, then nothing had happened at all, and the 4 minutes she had spent lying on cold boards with her heart going were simply 4 minutes of an ordinary night in an occupied country. She never settled it, and the not settling became its own education, one that outlasted the winter.
The last winter was different. The war had turned by then, and everyone in the house could feel it turning through the walls, in the trucks moving at strange hours, in the way orders were shouted in the street, in the officer's face when he came home in the evening. He stopped playing the piano. He took his meals with the door closed, and twice she heard him on the telephone in a voice she had never heard him use, low and fast, and stripped of its careful politeness. A man who has been unreadable for 2 years becomes very readable when he is afraid, and what frightened her was not the fear, but its arithmetic. Frightened men make decisions, and every decision he had left would be made inside her house. Her aunt moved the radio that week. She did not say where, and Audrey did not ask, and neither of them ever mentioned the attic board again for as long as they lived together in that house. There was one evening near the end when he came home earlier than usual and stood for a long time in the hall at the foot of the stairs. She watched him from the landing through the banister rails, and for the first time in 2 years she saw him do something that was not controlled. He put one hand flat against the wall and left it there and did not move. Then he straightened his coat and went into the front room and closed the door, and the whole thing had taken perhaps 15 seconds. She never mentioned it to anyone. It felt like something she had stolen from him by seeing it.
He left on a morning in spring, and there was no announcement. She woke to a silence that was the wrong shape, went down to the landing, and saw the front room door standing open for the first time in 2 years. The room was empty. The leather case was gone. The bed was made with a precision that seemed almost like a message. The piano lid was closed. On the small table by the window sat the household ration book that had gone missing from the kitchen drawer 11 months earlier, the one whose loss had cost them a fortnight of hunger. It had been there all along, in his room, 1 floor below them, for 11 months. Or it had been returned that morning. There was no note, no mark, nothing to say which. The family stood in the doorway of their own front room looking at a small booklet on a table, and nobody said anything at all. And then her aunt picked it up and put it in her apron pocket and went to make tea. Later she went into the room, which she had not entered in 2 years, and found it as impersonal as the day he arrived. No papers, no dust in the corners, a faint smell of shoe polish and cold ash.
She stood in the middle of her own front room, feeling absurdly like a trespasser, then opened the piano lid and pressed one key, just to hear the house make a sound that belonged to them again. It was badly out of tune. That, more than the empty room or the made bed, was the thing that finally made her sit down on the piano stool and put her hands over her face.
Years later, when she had become someone whose face the whole world recognized, she was asked in an interview what the war had taught her, and she gave the answer she always gave, about food and gratitude and children. What she did not describe was a house with 17 stairs and a man in the room below, or the particular skill of crossing a landing at midnight without making a sound, or the fact that some part of her never entirely stopped counting footsteps for the rest of her life. She never learned his name. She never learned whether he heard her that night in February, whether he took the ration book or found it, whether he survived the spring. He simply occupied 2 winters of her life completely, and then walked out of it, leaving behind a made bed, a closed piano, and a question she carried for 50 years. This story is a work of fiction. The officer, the aunt, and the events described here are imagined, created for storytelling. They are inspired by a real and ordinary fact of life in the occupied Netherlands, that thousands of families spent the war sharing their homes with the men who had taken their country. It is the kind of question you stop trying to answer and simply keep, the way you keep an object whose purpose you have forgotten but cannot bring yourself to throw away. She had been taught, very early and very thoroughly, that the most important thing about a person is often the thing you will never be permitted to know.